The desert wind carried dust and memories across the vast expanse of Joshua Martin's ranch as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Joshua had worked this land for 37 years, and in all that time he had learned to read the signs that nature whispered to those who knew how to listen. The approaching storm clouds meant more than rain to come. They meant travelers would soon be seeking shelter. Sure enough, as the first drops began to fall, Joshua spotted two figures moving slowly across the scrubland toward his homestead. Through the gathering dusk he could make out a woman walking beside a man on horseback. Even from a distance, something about their movement spoke of exhaustion and desperation. By the time they reached his porch, the rain had begun in earnest. The woman's dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her clothes bore the stains and tears of hard travel. The man who helped her dismount moved with the careful deliberation of someone nursing wounds. Joshua stepped out onto his covered porch and took in the scene before him. These weren't the usual drifters or cattle hands who sometimes passed through. There was something different about this pair, something that spoke of educated backgrounds and gentler times. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and hope. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a worn leather sack tied to her waist. "Please," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Take them off." Joshua frowned, not understanding what she meant. The woman's companion, a young man with kind eyes despite his obvious fatigue, stepped closer. "She means these," he said quietly and gestured to heavy iron shackles around the woman's wrists. Joshua's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. The metal bands were old and rusted but still secure. They had clearly been worn for a long time. The skin beneath showed the pale marks of prolonged captivity. Without hesitation, Joshua nodded and motioned them inside. "Come in out of the storm," he said. "We'll see about getting those off." His workshop held tools accumulated over decades of ranch work. Among them was a set of metal cutters strong enough for the task. As he worked carefully to avoid injuring her already damaged wrists, Joshua listened to their story. The woman, whose name was Sarah, had been held against her will for 3 years. The man Thomas had helped her escape from a situation too dark to dwell upon. They had been traveling for weeks seeking safety and a place to start over. The shackles had been kept on as a cruel reminder of her captivity, but also had served a practical purpose during their escape. Removing them too soon might have drawn unwanted attention from those who might recognize what they meant. Now, however, they had traveled far enough that freedom could truly begin. As the metal finally gave way and the shackles fell to the floor, Sarah began to weep. Not from pain, though her wrists were raw and sore, but from the overwhelming realization that this chapter of her life was finally closed. Joshua set down his tools and stepped back, giving her the space she needed for this moment. Thomas moved to comfort her, but she held up a hand. "Let me feel this," she whispered. "Just for a moment, let me feel what it means to be free." The three of them stood in the lamplight workshop, surrounded by the tools of honest work and the promise of new beginnings. Outside the storm raged, but inside there was warmth and safety. Joshua had seen enough of life to know that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is simply the acknowledgement of their humanity. Over the following days, as Sarah's wrists began to heal, Joshua learned more about his unexpected guests. Sarah had once been a schoolteacher in a small town back east. Thomas had been studying to become a minister when their paths crossed. Their story was one of courage in the face of unimaginable circumstances and of the power of human kindness to overcome the darkest situations. Joshua found himself drawn to their quiet strength. Sarah helped with the household tasks, refusing to be treated as an invalid despite her recent ordeal. Her hands were gentle with the injured animals Joshua sometimes brought in from the range. Thomas proved handy with repairs and seemed grateful for the honest work. In the evenings they would sit on the porch and talk. Sarah spoke of her dreams of teaching again, of finding a small town where she could help children learn and grow. Thomas talked about his calling to serve others and how their shared experience had only strengthened his faith in the goodness that could exist between people. Joshua found himself sharing stories of his own. About his late wife Mary, who had passed 5 years earlier. About the loneliness of working the land without someone to share its beauty. About the satisfaction that came from providing shelter to those who needed it. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Sarah and Thomas were not merely recovering from their ordeal. They were discovering something new between them. A bond forged in shared hardship was deepening into something more tender and lasting. Joshua watched this unfold with the satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to recognize real love when he saw it. The day came when Thomas asked Joshua if he could marry them. There was no minister within 100 miles and no church building anywhere on the horizon. But Joshua had seen enough of life to know that love blessed by genuine witness was as sacred as any ceremony. He agreed, and they chose a spot on a hill overlooking the ranch where the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah wore a simple dress that Joshua's late wife had left behind. It fit her perfectly, as if Mary herself had chosen to be part of this moment. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt and the smile of a man who had found his purpose. Joshua spoke words about commitment and kindness, about the strength that comes from facing life's challenges together. He talked about how love grows not just in the easy moments but especially in the times when we choose to stand by each other despite our fears and uncertainties. As the sun set behind them, Sarah and Thomas exchanged vows they had written themselves. Simple promises to honor each other's past while building something new together. To never take their freedom for granted. To use their second chance at life to help others who might be struggling. When Joshua pronounced them married, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The three of them stood together in comfortable silence, watching the vast desert landscape settle into evening. It was Sarah who finally spoke. "Thank you," she said to Joshua. "Not just for removing the shackles but for seeing us as people worth helping." Joshua nodded, understanding that her gratitude went far deeper than the practical assistance he had provided. "Sometimes," he replied, "the most important thing we can do is simply recognize another person's dignity. The rest takes care of itself." In the months that followed, Sarah and Thomas made plans to head further west to California, where they had heard of opportunities for people willing to work hard and start fresh. But they were in no hurry to leave. The ranch had become a place of healing for all three of them. Joshua had found companionship in his later years. Sarah had discovered that her capacity for joy had not been destroyed by her trials. Thomas had learned that his calling to help others could take many forms. When they finally did prepare to leave, it was with the knowledge that they would always have a place to return to. Joshua insisted on giving them supplies for their journey and enough money to get properly established. More than that, though, he gave them something invaluable. The confidence that comes from being seen and accepted for who you truly are. The morning of their departure, Sarah stood once more in the workshop where her shackles had been removed. She ran her fingers over the tools that had given her back her freedom and thought about all the other forms of bondage that people carry. Some are visible, like the iron bands she had worn. Others are invisible but just as real. The chains of fear and shame and doubt that keep people from becoming who they were meant to be. She realized that Joshua's gift had been about much more than cutting through metal. It had been about recognizing her inherent worth and treating her accordingly. As their wagon pulled away from the ranch, Sarah and Thomas turned back for one last look. Joshua stood on his porch, raising a weathered hand in farewell. The image would stay with them for the rest of their lives. An older man who had chosen kindness over suspicion. Who had seen two strangers in need and opened not just his door but his heart. Years later, when Sarah was teaching in a small California town and Thomas was ministering to a growing congregation, they would tell their story to others. Not the dark parts that had brought them together, but the bright ending that had shown them what was possible when people choose to help rather than judge. They spoke of Joshua's quiet wisdom and gentle strength. Of how he had demonstrated that healing could happen in unexpected places. That freedom was not just about removing external constraints but about helping others recognize their own worth. The letters they exchanged with Joshua over the years were filled with updates about their growing family, their work in the community, and their continued gratitude for the kindness that had changed their lives. Joshua's responses were brief but warm, always ending with the same message. Remember that you have everything within you that you need to help others find their own freedom. Use it well. When Joshua passed away 10 years later at the age of 78, he left his ranch to Sarah and Thomas with the provision that it continue to serve as a place of refuge for those who needed it. They returned for his funeral and stayed long enough to establish a small foundation that would maintain the property and its mission. The workshop where Sarah's shackles had been removed was preserved exactly as Joshua had left it. Tools arranged with care. Workbench worn smooth by decades of use. A simple sign over the door that read, "Freedom begins when we choose to see each other's humanity." Visitors to the ranch often asked about the significance of that workshop. Sarah would tell them about a desert storm and an old rancher who had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness are also the simplest. Take them off, he had said when she asked. And in doing so had given her back not just her physical freedom but her faith in the goodness of people. The story spread throughout the region and beyond. Not as a tale of dramatic rescue but as a quiet reminder of what becomes possible when we respond to others with generosity rather than fear. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, Joshua's example stood as proof that individual acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways that changed not just one life but many. Sarah and Thomas lived long lives filled with purpose and joy. They raised children who understood the value of helping others. They built a community that prioritized compassion over judgment. And they never forgot the lesson learned on a stormy night in the desert: that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is something that grows in the space between people when they choose to honor each other's dignity. The shackles that had bound Sarah's wrists were just metal. The real chains that held people captive were made of fear and despair and the belief that no one cared enough to help. Joshua had shown them that those chains could be broken too. Not with tools but with the simple decision to treat each person as worthy of respect and assistance. His legacy lived on in every act of kindness that followed. In every moment when someone chose to help rather than turn away. In every recognition that we are all more alike than different in our need for compassion and connection. The desert wind still carries dust and memories across that ranch. But now it also carries the whispered reminder of what one person's kindness can accomplish. When we choose to see each other's humanity. When we offer help without judgment. When we remember that freedom is not just about removing external constraints but about helping others recognize their own inherent worth. The tools in that workshop remain ready. Not just for cutting through metal. But for the more important work of cutting through the barriers that keep us from recognizing our shared humanity. And sometimes late in the evening when the sun sets over the desert. Visitors say they can still hear Joshua's voice carried on the wind. Reminding them that the most powerful force for change in this world is not grand gestures or dramatic interventions. But the quiet daily decision to treat each person we meet with dignity and respect. To be ready when someone asks for help. To remember that we all carry shackles of one kind or another. And that freedom multiplies when we help each other break free.